Good day, everyone. I am John, your moderator for this webinar. I welcome everyone for today's webinar, which is called Excel Pivot Tables, the key to modern data analysis and reporting. I would like to introduce our presenter for today, Mike Thomas. Mike Thomas has worked in the IT training business since 1989. He is a subject matter expert in the range of technologies, including Microsoft Office and Apple Mac. So now I would like to hand over the floor back to our speaker. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, John. Hello and welcome, everybody. So pivot tables. I'm going to start right at the beginning with pivot tables and explain what they are. So I have here some data. This is some made-up sales data for a company that makes and sells different flavors of ice cream. And we need to analyze this data. We need to report on this data in different ways. Now, I could create some manual reports. So what's the benefit of a pivot table? Well, the benefit of a pivot table is that it's a lot easier to create what you need. So as I say, pivot tables allow you to create fairly complex reports and summaries without having to do it manually. So just pick a single cell and then click on Insert Pivot Table. I just need to select one of the cells in this area here. This is the pivot table placeholder, as I call it. I drag the appropriate headings from this section to these boxes here. Let's say I then changed my mind and I didn't want the cost. All I do is drag cost out of the values section and drop it back in this top section. So you're just dragging it the other way and it removes it from the pivot table. A calculated field is an extra column in the pivot table that you generate from a formula, not from dragging one of these in. How do we change things like the headings, the colors, the fonts, and so on and so forth? You just go in and overtype the text that's in there with the text that you want. There are a number of operations that you can do in Excel that cause a pivot table to be regenerated. One of those things is sorting the pivot table. Another thing that can cause the pivot table to reset itself is when you update it. To click Data Refresh All. Next thing we'll look at is how to do a count. A couple of negatives, a couple of downsides of this filter drop down. One is that you have to remember to tick that box if you want to be able to select more than one item. And the other thing is, if you do select more than one item, it doesn't actually tell you which ones you've selected. Which brings us nicely onto slicers. Slicers as a concept is exactly the same as what we've just done, where we've applied a filter. Slicers give you all the functionality of the filtering, but in a much better way. A slicer is a set of buttons that are clickable that act as filters, but slicers have a number of benefits. One is the slicer can be positioned anywhere. Also with a slicer you can visually see which items you've selected, and probably most beneficial of all is that a slicer can be attached to more than one pivot table. So instead of having 3 filters as we had before, we can have one slicer connected to all 3 pivot tables. So how does the slicer work? Well, as I said, there's a set of buttons, and as you click a button, it applies a filter. But there's a bit more you can do with slicers. You can change the colors of the buttons. Next thing then is to look at charts. How can we create a chart from the data? Then you need to highlight them all and then click on Insert and choose the type of chart that you want. You can just pick one cell in the pivot table, go to Insert, choose the type of chart you want, and it builds you a chart. The quicker way to do it is to click on Data Refresh All, and that has updated all 3 pivot tables. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end of the session. Okay, well, all it remains for me to say is I hope that's been a useful session. Thank you very much for attending. I hope you've got something out of it. And until the next time we meet, have a good rest of day and keep safe, everybody.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, participants. So with this, we conclude the session for today. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.